You have been to this parking lot 100 times. You know this store. You have walked this exact route from the entrance to the section you need without thinking about it since before you can remember. And then, one afternoon, you walk out through the sliding doors, bags in hand, and the lot simply does not resolve. You know your car is out there. You know which direction you drove in from. But for a long, disorienting moment, none of that is available. And you are standing on the curb, scanning rows of cars, trying to look purposeful while something underneath you quietly gives way. Most people chalk that up to distraction, stress, a busy week. But if it has happened more than once, if familiar places have started carrying a faint sense of unreliability, a half-second delay before they feel like themselves again, I need you to hear what I'm about to tell you. Because that experience has a specific biological name, it has a specific cause, and that cause is something you almost certainly do every single day without giving it a second thought. I'm Dr. Eleanor Vance, 32 years in clinical neurology, and among the symptoms that bring patients to my office, the ones that disturb them most quietly, not the dramatic forgetting, but the subtle spatial unreliability, are the ones I take most seriously. Because spatial memory is not a minor faculty. It is one of the earliest and most reliable indicators of hippocampal function. And when the hippocampus begins to lose ground, the rest of the cognitive picture tends to follow. What I have had to reckon with, professionally, is that a habit we have universally embraced and never questioned may be one of the most significant contributors to this specific decline. Navigation technology, GPS, turn-by-turn apps, the automatic routing that now lives in every phone and every car, was designed to reduce cognitive load. And it does. That is precisely the problem. Because spatial memory is not a passive archive, it is an active, use-dependent system. The hippocampus builds and maintains mental maps of the world through direct, effortful engagement with the environment. When a device does that work instead, the hippocampus is not freed up for other things. It atrophies from the absence of the challenge. Decades of neuroscience have made this clear, most famously in studies of professional navigators who must build and hold complex spatial maps from memory, where hippocampal volume is measurably larger than in controls. Remove the navigational demand, and the tissue responds accordingly. And compounding that atrophy is a second process that receives almost no attention in mainstream guidance. Research examining antioxidant defense pathways in aging neural tissue found that one of the brain's primary cellular defenses against oxidative damage suppresses under chronic neuroinflammatory load. As oxidative stress accumulates in hippocampal tissue, the brain's ability to protect and maintain those spatial circuits weakens from two directions at once: disuse from the outside and oxidative corrosion from within. These are not separate problems. They are compounding ones. This channel is built around one commitment: giving you the clinical information that should have been part of your last appointment but wasn't, because 15 minutes is not enough time to explain what is actually happening inside your own brain. If that matters to you, subscribe. Not as a favor, because you deserve a source that treats you as the intelligent, capable adult you intend to stay. And if that parking lot moment, that brief, floating disorientation in a place that should be completely familiar, is something you have lived recently, type the word "lost" in the comments right now. Because that word describes the symptom, but it also describes what the research has finally found about its cause. And by the end of this video, you will know what to do about it. I want to give you a picture of what spatial memory actually is, at the biological level, so that what I am about to explain makes complete sense. Deep in the brain sits the hippocampus. Among its primary functions is building, storing, and retrieving what neuroscientists call cognitive maps, internal representations of the physical world around you. Every time you navigate a familiar environment without assistance, you are activating and reinforcing those maps, maintaining the neural pathways that encode them, and signaling to the brain that this architecture is worth preserving. The hippocampus is one of the very few brain regions that can generate new neurons in adulthood, but it only does so in response to demand. Withdraw the demand, and the signal to maintain and grow that tissue goes quiet. Here is where the GPS habit intersects with something far more serious than simple skill atrophy. Think of an old lighthouse keeper who has spent 30 years reading the coastline, climbing the stairs, manually tending the mechanism. When an automated signal system is installed and the keeper is told to stand down, two things begin to happen simultaneously. First, the keeper's navigational knowledge, the deep embodied familiarity with every reef and current, starts to fade from disuse. Second, without regular maintenance, the mechanism inside the lighthouse begins to corrode. Rust forms on joints that were once polished smooth. The light still turns, but the motion becomes effortful, imprecise. The keeper has lost their edge, and the structure has begun to degrade from within. That is your hippocampus on chronic GPS reliance. The navigational demand disappears, and two compounding processes begin in parallel. Nerve growth factor, the biological signal that maintains and rebuilds neural connections, drops because the connectivity it was sustaining is no longer being called upon. Oxidative stress accumulates in hippocampal tissue, generating tau protein and beta amyloid buildup that creates neurochemical interference in the spatial circuits. The map is still in there. The coastline hasn't changed, but the keeper can no longer read it cleanly, and the mechanism corroding from within is making the signal harder and harder to retrieve. A 2023 study identified a compound isolated from tamarin pulp that produced direct, measurable reductions in tau and beta amyloid levels. And crucially, the research measured improvement through spatial navigation tasks specifically, documenting faster, more accurate route completion in models of cognitive impairment. That is not incidental. Spatial memory is where this intervention was tested, and spatial memory is where the results showed up first. Before we go further, I want to speak to what you have probably already tried for this, because by the time someone is experiencing what I just described, they have not been passive. If you have tried spatial puzzle apps, the games designed to train your internal sense of direction, map rotation, visual spatial reasoning, you may have noticed that you got better at the app and nothing changed in the parking lot. That is because a two-dimensional puzzle on a glass screen does not engage the hippocampal mapping system the same way three-dimensional environmental navigation does. You were exercising a proxy. The keeper stayed idle. If you have been writing things down, keeping notes on where you parked, leaving yourself voice memos about which entrance you used, you were solving for the symptom with more technology, which is the same habit in a different form. The compensation works in the moment. It does not rebuild anything. And if a doctor recommended B12 or a general multivitamin for memory concerns and the spatial problem persisted unchanged, it is because neither of those addresses the oxidative accumulation inside the hippocampal tissue or the NGF deficit preventing its repair. They were treating a generic presentation of memory concern. You had something more specific, and it needed a more specific response. Here is what the recovery arc actually looks like when the mechanism, not just the habit, is addressed. Day 1, nothing visible. The neuroinflammatory pressure on hippocampal tissue that has been compressing its regenerative capacity begins to ease. The oxidative burden that has been suppressing the brain's antioxidant defense pathways starts to lift, very slightly, at the cellular level. The keeper has not yet returned to the stairs, but the corrosion on the mechanism has begun, quietly, to respond to something that is finally working in the right direction. You may feel nothing on day 1. that is not a sign it isn't working. And I want to say clearly before going further, this only unfolds this way with an intervention that targets the specific biological failures I described: the corrosion, the NGF deficit, the interference in the spatial circuits. A general supplement adds to a broken system. It does not repair it. The right tool matters absolutely here. Day 3. You go to a large store you frequent, the kind with wide aisles and multiple sections where you have, in recent months, felt that brief, floating moment of spatial uncertainty near the entrance, the moment of not quite knowing which direction to orient before the layout resolves. This time, you walk through the doors and you turn left without hesitating. You know where you are going. The layout is simply available to you, the way it used to be before you started noticing that it sometimes wasn't. But what you carry with you out of that store is not the turn itself. It is the absence of the pause. The particular internal bracing, the microsecond of held breath before entering a space, waiting to find out whether your brain is going to cooperate today, does not happen. You walk in, you know where you are, and you feel, for the first time in a while, like someone who is at home in the world. Day 2. What was happening behind the scenes? What made day 3 possible was entirely invisible on day 2. Autophagy, the brain's cellular cleanup process, had begun clearing tau protein deposits from the hippocampal pathways, encoding the spatial maps that had been degrading. GPX and SOD enzyme systems, suppressed by months of accumulated oxidative load, were reactivating and scavenging the reactive oxygen species corroding those circuits. And nerve growth factor synthesis, the signal that tells the hippocampus to maintain and rebuild its navigational architecture, was beginning to recover. None of this is something you can feel. It is quiet biological repair, running below any threshold of conscious experience. But it is the reason the doors opened the right way on day 3. Day 5. Your daughter asks you to drive somewhere, a neighborhood you know well, a route you drove without thinking for years before you started quietly defaulting to the phone's directions just to be safe. You drive it without the phone, all of it, and you arrive. Your daughter does not say anything, but you catch her expression, not surprise, something quieter. She has been watching. They all have, in that careful, loving way that carries its own particular weight. And the fear that has been following you, the specific dread that one day the keys would not be optional, that someone who loves you would decide for you that you were no longer safe, loosens its grip. Not gone, but loosened. Day 7. It is not a dramatic morning. You wake up, you move through your home, and you know where everything is the way you always used to, without accounting for it, without the small background relief of finding things where you expected them. You drive to a familiar place without opening the app. You park. You walk in. And on the way back out, you find your car immediately, without scanning, without the clenched stomach moment of searching. You are oriented. You are present in your own geography. You feel, quietly and completely, like someone who knows where they are. After 32 years of neurology, I will tell you plainly that I do not trust the supplement category for brain health. The products in it are almost uniformly designed for the marketing department, not for the mechanism. Most have never been evaluated through the lens of what spatial memory specifically requires to recover. So here is what I require. 4 things, and all 4 are mandatory. First, it must actively stimulate nerve growth factor synthesis, not vaguely support it, but drive the signal that tells the hippocampus to rebuild the navigational architecture that disuse and oxidative damage have eroded. Without NGF, the recovery process cannot begin at the structural level. Second, it must target oxidative stress in hippocampal tissue with compounds that have demonstrated specific neuroprotective activity. scavenging the reactive oxygen species that have been corroding the spatial circuits from within, and reactivating the antioxidant enzyme pathways that chronic neuroinflammation suppressed. Third, it must directly reduce existing tau and beta amyloid accumulation in the spatial memory pathways. Not slow future deposits, but clear what is already interfering with the signal. The tamarind research I described was evaluated specifically through a spatial navigation measure. That is not a coincidence. That is the mechanism being directly addressed. Fourth, it must actually reach the hippocampus. The vast majority of brain supplements are encapsulated in forms that lose significant potency to digestion before anything crosses the blood-brain barrier. A compound that cannot reach the tissue it is targeting does nothing for that tissue, regardless of how well researched it is in isolation. Most of the category meets none of these. Almost nothing in it meets all four. What does is what I am going to tell you about now. Neuroprime is the formula that meets every one of those criteria. And I want to be careful and precise when I say that, because I know how hollow that kind of claim can sound in this space. It is a liquid drop, not a capsule, which resolves the absorption problem at the foundation. Its formulation includes lion's mane, the compound most directly linked to nerve growth factor synthesis, and the tamarind isolate tied specifically to the tau and beta amyloid research that used spatial navigation as its primary outcome measure. The full ingredient rationale, all 9 compounds, what each targets, and the science behind each choice is explained in detail on the page linked below this video. If what I described today is the map of what you have been living, the parking lot, the familiar turn that suddenly requires effort, the geography of your own life becoming unreliable, that page is where I would go next. Not as a sales step, as the clinical next step that this video has been building toward. 1 drop each morning, under the tongue or in your coffee, your tea, whatever you are already drinking. 10 seconds. No new regimen. Nothing that adds friction to a morning that already has enough of it. Most people notice something real within the first week. A subtle but genuine increase in spatial ease. A morning that feels marginally more oriented than the one before. Full results build over 30 to 60 days. I am being honest about the timeline because the honest timeline is the one that works. Expecting something on day 2 and feeling nothing is how people quit on day 3, when day 7 was where the change was waiting. The guarantee is 365 days. Full refund, no questions, return whatever you have left. There is no financial risk in trying this. The only risk I can identify is continuing to navigate your own life from a place of quiet spatial uncertainty and calling it normal aging when it is not. Before you go, type the word home in the comments. Because knowing where you are, in a parking lot, on a familiar drive, inside your own neighborhood, inside your own life, is not a small thing to protect. It is one of the most fundamental ways we experience being ourselves. Type it. Mark this as the moment you decided to protect it. And if someone you know has started defaulting to GPS for routes they drove for 20 years, laughing it off, calling themselves bad with directions now, share this video with them. What you now know is not obvious. Most people never hear it. Pass it along. You know where you are. You know what to do next. The link is below.